The capture of 20 NATO military personnel, including high-ranking British officers and an intelligence agent, has acted as a powerful accelerant to a much deeper and more dangerous crisis unfolding within the Ukrainian armed force. The event itself was a symptom of a creeping military decay, but its shockwaves have now triggered a potential collapse in morale and discipline that threatened to do what years of Russian assault could not: break the back of the Ukrainian army. Reports emerging from the front lines, particularly around the besieged city of Pokrovsk, paint a picture of a military teetering on the brink. The initial shock of the capture and the decapitation of a key command sector has cascaded into a crisis of confidence, fueling a spike in desertion, refusals to fight, and unauthorized retreats. What was once a slow grinding advance by Russian force is now threatening to turn into a full-blown rout in critical sectors, as the internal cohesions of some of Ukraine's most battle-hardened units begins to fray and then snap. The war has entered a new and perilous phase, where the primary enemy for Ukrainian commanders is not just the Russian army, but the growing despair and exhaustion within their own ranks. Critical ammunition shortage have crippled Ukrainian resistance. Soldiers from the 110th Territorial Defense Brigade reported firing just 3 artillery shells daily compared to Russia's 300-round barrage. A leaked internal memo from Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky acknowledged frontline units possess only 8% of required 155mm shells, despite the U.S. aid package approved in April. Russian Lancet drones now destroy up to 40 Ukrainian artillery pieces weekly, with survivors describing the battlefield as hell parking lot, where any vehicle movement draws immediate swarm attack. The collapse has enabled Russia's 15th Motorized Rifle Division to advance 9 kilometers in 5 days, their fastest territorial gain since Bakhmut's fall. The crisis is most acute and visible in the battle for Pokrovsk. This city, a vital railway hub and a logistical linchpin for the entire Ukrainian defense in the Donbass, is now the scene of a cascading military disaster. Following the successful Russian strike on the underground command bunker, the leadership of the Ukrainian force in that specific sector was effectively wiped out. The colonels and planners who had been coordinating the defense were either killed or captured, leaving a vacuum of command at the most critical moment. This single event created chaos among the defending brigades. Orders ceased to come down the chain of command, artillery support became uncoordinated, and individual units were left isolated, unsure of the status of the units to their left and right. Russian forces, exploiting this command paralysis with ruthless efficiency, immediately pressed their advantage. They used electronic warfare to jam Ukrainian communications, further isolating units, while their reconnaissance drones pinpoint the new seams and gaps that were opening up in the Ukrainian line. Russian psychological operations went into overdrive, broadcasting message across Ukrainian radio frequency, telling soldiers that their commanders had abandoned them and that their position was hopeless, urging them to lay down their arms. This combination of leadership, decapitation, and psychological pressure has triggered a wave of what Ukrainian officials are desperately trying to label as unauthorized repositioning, but which on the ground looks like a panic retreat. Entire companies left without orders and seeing their flanks exposed as neighboring units fell back had begun to abandon their prepared defensive position. These are not cowards. Many are veterans of years of brutal fighting, but they are men who have reached their absolute physical and psychological limits. After months of enduring relentless artillery barrage with no adequate counter-battery fire, and living under the daily terror of massive FAB glide bombs that can obliterate their bunkers, the will to fight has been eroded to a nub. The capture of the NATO officers confirmed their worst fear, that even with Western help, they could be encircled and annihilated. For many, the instinct for self-preservation has finally overtaken the duty to hold their ground at any cost. This has created a domino effect. As one unit pulls back, it exposes the flank of the next, forcing that unit to also retreat to avoid being cut off. This is how a controlled defense disintegrates into a chaotic rout, and Russian armor columns are now pushing through these gaps, advancing several kilometers in a single day, a pace unseen in this region for over a year. Ukrainian defenses near Pokrovsk has disintegrated under relentless Russian assault, triggering the largest wave of desertions since the war began. The 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade lost over 60% of its combat strength in 72 hours as troops abandoned positions along the Sieversky-Donetsk Canal. Eyewitnesses described columns of soldiers discarding uniforms near Lidov before fleeing westward, with intercepted radio transmission revealing battalion commanders ordering retreats without authorization. Russia's Central Military District Force exploited the chaos to capture Volodar's strategic heights, closing Pokrovsk's eastern flank. Satellite imagery show Russian engineering units constructing pontoons bridge across the canal, enabling tank columns to bypass Ukraine's primary defense barrier. The problem of desertion is no longer an isolated issue, but is becoming a systematic crisis for the Ukrainian military. The phenomenon ranged from individual soldiers quietly slipping away from their positions at night to entire squads making the collective decision to abandon the front. These are not just new, poorly trained recruits, but increasingly they include seasoned veterans who feels they have been sacrificed. They walk for days avoiding military patrols, trying to make their way back to their homes, or simply to disappear into the civilian population. Ukraine's military police have established checkpoints along major roads leading away from the front, but their efforts are like trying to stop a flood with a handful of sandbags. The sheer number of men attempting to leave the war zone is overwhelming the system. This has created a secondary crisis within Ukrainian society. Videos are appearing on social media posted by desperate wives and mothers pleading for the government to rotate their husbands and sons off the front line, some of whom have been fighting for more than 2 years without a significant break. These videos are amplifying the sense of hopelessness and creating political pressure on the government, which is caught in an impossible position. It lacks the trained manpower to fully rotate its frontline brigades, but forcing exhausted men to continue fighting indefinitely is proving to be a recipe for military collapse. The government in Kyiv is attempting to respond with desperate measure. It has rushed some of its last remaining strategy reserve units to the Pokrovsk front to try and plug the gaps and stabilize the line. These are often more motivated and better equipped units, but they are being thrown into a chaotic situation, often without a clear picture of the battlefield, and are taking heavy casualties. The Ukrainian Security Service, the SBU, has also been deployed to the front line. The mission is to act as barrier troops, tasked with identifying and arresting deserters, and, in some reported case, using forces to compel retreating units to turn around and fight. This tactic, reminiscent of the most brutal periods of the Second World War, is a sign of extreme desperation. While it may temporarily prevent a retreat in one specific location, it is a deeply corrosive measure that destroys trust between soldiers and the state they are supposed to be fighting for. It turns the war into a two-front battle for the Ukrainian soldier, with the Russian army in front of them and their own security service behind them. This approach is not a sustainable solution and is likely to further accelerate the decline in morale. In Washington, the grim news from the Ukrainian front is being received with growing alarm. The reports of collapsing morale and widespread desertions are confirming the intelligence community's most pessimistic assessment. Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth is receiving daily briefing from the Defense Intelligence Agency that detail the rapid deteriorations of Ukrainian units' cohesion. Satellite imagery confirms the scales of the Russian advance near Pokrovsk, showing entire defensive lines that were held for months now being overrun. Secretary Hegseth is in direct communication with the top Ukrainian military command, offering American intelligence and advisory supports. But he's acutely aware that the problem is no longer simply a matter of equipment. The United States can send more tanks and artillery, but it cannot send morale or the will to fight. The crisis has forced a fundamental reevaluation of American strategy. The conversation within the Pentagon is shifting from how to help Ukraine win to how to prevent a total catastrophic collapse of the Ukrainian armed force. which would have disastrous consequences for the security of Europe. The provision of aid is now being seen as a form of emergency life support, an attempt to keep the patient alive rather than a cure for the underlying disease. The diplomatic implications of the military crisis are also profound. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is engaged in a difficult and delicate balancing act. He is trying to project an image of unwavering American support for Ukraine to the international community, while privately grappling with the reality that the Ukrainian military is faltering. He is working with European allies to accelerate the delivery of promised aid, hoping that a new influx of weapons might help to boost morale. However, he is also facing increasingly pointed questions from allies who are beginning to doubt the viability of the Ukrainian war effort. Capture of the NATO personnel combined with the news of the military internal crisis has emboldened those in Europe who have been arguing for a negotiated settlement, even on terms unfavorable to Ukraine. They argue that continuing to pour weapons into what looks like a losing effort is a waste of resource and risk a wider war. Secretary Rubio is pushing back against this narrative, arguing that abandoning Ukraine now would be a historic mistake that would hand a major victory to Russia and destabilize Europe for decades. But his arguments are becoming harder to make as the news from the front continues to worsen. The intelligence community is providing a bleak and unvarnished picture to President Trump. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard has presented an assessment that warns of a high probability of a major Ukrainian military defeat in the Donbass within the coming weeks if the current trends are not reversed. Her report highlighted the systematic nature of the crisis, pointing out that the problems of ammunition shortage, manpower exhaustions, and leadership failures are all interconnected and feeding off one another. The Central Intelligence Agency under Director John Ratcliffe is providing granular intelligence on the Russian exploitation of the situation. CIA reports detail how Russian special force and psychological warfare units are working in tandem to identify and target the weakest point in the Ukrainian lines, effectively engineering localized collapse that they can then exploit with their armored force. His intelligence confirms that Russia is not just winning through brute force, but through a sophisticated and adaptive strategy designed to take advantage of its opponent's internal weaknesses. For President Trump, this presents an acute political and strategic dilemma. He is now faced with the very real prospect of the country he has been supporting with billions of dollars of American aid suffering a decisive military defeat. This would not only be a major foreign policy failure, but would also raise difficult questions about the future of European security and America's role in the world. The deepening crisis in the Ukrainian military has moved beyond the battlefields of the Donbass. It has now become a full-blown crisis for the Western alliance and a defining challenges for the Trump administration. Many of my listeners, like 70%, haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel. And so many of you don't even know that you haven't subscribed. And that is actually what makes the show going. It's almost like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask again and again, because it enables us to grow and grow and grow. And we're going for the long haul here. And listen, if this is your first time listening to World Global Conflict, you don't have to subscribe. You guys, your first ones on me. But if you have watched this show before, it's like you are a freeloader now. So all I would ask you is, if you have seen this show before and you like it, help me, help my team here. Hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build the show for you. That I swear. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's all for me for today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.